The silence in the throne room was a physical presence, a weight of 10,000 years that pressed down upon the polished obsidian floor. It was a silence woven from dust motes dancing in beams of golden light, from the faint, ozone-tinged hum of ancient machinery, and from the collective, breathless reverence of an empire. Here, at the very heart of the Imperium of man, time itself seemed to have curdled and stilled. A lone custodian guard stood his watch, a giant of burnished oromite and crimson plumes, his every sense attuned to the sanctum he was sworn to protect until the stars themselves died. His helm, a masterpiece of artistry and death, was turned toward the center of the immense chamber, toward the source of the light and the silence and the hope of a million worlds. Before him, encased within the incalculable complexity of the golden throne, sat the master of mankind. The emperor's form was a paradox of ruin and radiance. His flesh, once vibrant and powerful, was now a desiccated husk, a grim effigy held together by will and arcane science. Yet from this still figure poured a torrent of psychic energy so vast it defied comprehension. A searing, beautiful, and terrible light haloed the throne, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of forgotten glories and ancient horrors. The custodian's gaze, filtered through his helmet's auto-senses, did not waver. He saw the skeletal hands resting on the armrests, the noble, sunken features forever locked in a rictus of agony and determination. He had stood this vigil for decades, a mere blink in the long watch, yet he felt the accumulated burden of every guardian who had come before him. His mind, a fortress trained to reject doubt, nonetheless drifted through the echoes of history that saturated the air. He thought of the Great Crusade, of a galaxy united under a living, breathing leader. He thought of the betrayal that shattered that dream, the heresy that forced this eternal, silent sacrifice. The faith of the Imperium was a guttering candle held against a howling galactic night, and this chamber was the hand that shielded its flame. That faith was a tangible thing here, a psychic resonance of trillions of souls praying, begging, and believing in the God Emperor who sustained them. It was a power as real as the plasma reactor deep below the palace, a force that the custodian could feel thrumming against his oromite plate. And yet beneath the monolithic certainty of his duty, a faint, unspoken sensation had begun to stir in recent cycles. It was not a sound, nor a sight, but a subtle shift in the throne room's metaphysical pressure, like the first, almost imperceptible drop in barometric pressure before a storm. It was a feeling that defied the 10 millennia-old narrative of stasis. A quiet, heretical, and yet fervent hope that perhaps, after this long and terrible silence, something was about to change. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, the golden light pulsing with a barely perceptible rhythm that was not there before. The custodian remained motionless, a statue of gold and resolve, but within his heart, a single forbidden question began to form, a question as fragile as a whispered prayer and as dangerous as a supernova. Across the sprawling, star-choked immensity of the Imperium, the dream began simultaneously, a psychic virus of impossible origin. In the insulated choir chambers of battleships, amidst the incense-heavy chapels of Schola Progeniums, and in the wretched, forgotten underhives where untrained psychers hid from the black ships, the same vision bloomed behind a million pairs of closed eyelids. It was a dream of pure, undiluted gold, not the color of metal, but of light itself, a warm, living, paternal radiance that promised an end to loneliness and fear. And within that light, a voice. It was not a word, nor a sound that traveled through air, but a concept, a feeling of immense, ancient recognition, as if a fundamental truth of the universe long forgotten had suddenly been remembered. On the bridge of the Gothic-class cruiser Righteous Fury, Astropath Prime Kalen jolted in his restraint throne, his sightless eyes flying wide open. The constant screaming choir of the warp, the demonic cacophony that was the background static of his entire existence, suddenly stilled. For the first time in his 80 years of service, there was silence. A profound, terrifying, and beautiful quiet through which that golden presence flowed like a balm. He felt the psychic scars of a lifetime of listening to the abyss begin to knit closed. A tear of pure, unadulterated joy traced a path through the ritual scars on his cheek. He had spent his life navigating by the Emperor's Astronomicon, a distant, blazing lighthouse, but this was intimate. This was a hand on his shoulder. His faith, a disciplined and structured thing, shattered and reformed in an instant into something raw and personal, a devotion. So fierce it threatened to stop his heart. But not all minds were built to bear such a touch. In a dilapidated hab block on the industrial world of Viridia, a young, unsanctioned psyker named Alara woke from the dream screaming. For her, the light was not comforting but interrogating. It was a searing searchlight scouring the dark, shameful corners of her soul. The voice was not a welcome but an accusation. The sudden absence of the warp's chaotic murmur was not peace, but the vacuum before an explosion. Her mind, accustomed to the constant pressure, decompressed violently. She clawed at her own face, babbling half-remembered catechisms and heresies as the walls of her small room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of that distant, golden heart. By the time the enforcers broke down her door, drawn by the neighbors' reports of hysterical shrieking, she was a broken thing, curled in a corner, forever lost in the terrifying clarity of the divine. The phenomenon was not confined to humanity's sanctioned and unsanctioned seers. Deep within the Imperium, the great, sentient currents of the warp themselves grew sluggish and calm. The tempests that had raged for millennia, the whirlpools of ambition and despair, the tides of raw emotion that fed the ruinous powers all faltered. For a single, breathtaking moment, the sea of souls was becalmed. To those who sensed its flows, it was as if the entire galaxy had taken a deep, shuddering breath and held it. This was not a natural lull. It was the stillness of awe, the quiet of a predator sensing a larger, more ancient presence entering its territory. Some saw it as a miracle, the first true sign of their God Emperor's imminent return. Others, more versed in the horrors that dwelt in that realm, felt a deeper, more primal terror. They understood that the only thing more frightening than the eternal chaos of the warp was the thing powerful enough to command its silence. Navigator Valerius of House Benetech had guided the freighter. Stalwart promise through the roiling nightmares of the warp for 47 standard years. His entire existence was a delicate, perpetual dance on the edge of oblivion, his mutated third eye fixed upon the one constant in an ocean of insanity, the Astronomicon. That psychic beacon, a roaring star of pure order projected from holy Terra itself, was his compass, his anchor, the single thread of sanity that kept his vessel from being eternally lost. He felt its constant pressure against his warp sight, a familiar, demanding hum that was the very pulse of the Imperium. Then, without warning, it vanished. It was not a fading, not a dimming, but an absolute and total cessation. One moment the guiding light was there, a brilliant, unwavering pillar in the Empyrean. The next, there was only the howling, formless dark. For 3 full seconds, Valerius was utterly blind and adrift. The psychic shock was a physical blow, slamming him back into his amniotic tank with a force that cracked the reinforced glass. A silent scream tore from his throat as the raw, unfiltered chaos of the warp rushed in to fill the void. He felt the whispers of things with too many eyes, the pull of gravitational anomalies that did not obey natural law, the cold tendrils of despair that sought to snuff out his soul. His mind, so long disciplined to follow the Emperor's light, flailed in pure, animal terror. On the bridge of the stalwart promise, the shift was immediate and catastrophic. The steady thrum of the Geller field generator hitched, and the viewports, which moments before had shown the calming, ritualized patterns of calculated warp translation, flickered with impossible non-Euclidean geometries. Alarms blared as the ship's machine spirit, bereft of its celestial guide, sent conflicting course corrections through the navigation arrays. The captain, a stern-faced veteran of the Chartist captains, bellowed orders that were lost in the sudden pandemonium. Crewmen clutched at their stations, their faces etched with a superstitious dread far deeper than their fear of a hull breach. The one thing that could not fail, the divine light of the God Emperor, had been extinguished. For 3 endless seconds, the stalwart Promise and every other ship traversing the Imperium was truly and utterly alone. When the Astronomicon returned, its light was, to Valerius's strained senses, somehow different. It was the same in intensity, the same in its fundamental frequency, but it carried the faintest psychic echo, like a bell that had been struck by a different, unknown hand. He gasped, his body trembling uncontrollably as he re-established the ship's bearing, his voice a ragged croak over the vox to the bridge. The immediate crisis was averted, but the damage was done. Across the ship, and soon across the entire sector via frantic astropathic communiques, the rumors began to fly. The Emperor was dead, the Terran throne sat empty, and the long-predicted doom had finally come. Others, their voices trembling with a fervent, terrifying hope, whispered the opposite, that the God Emperor had stirred, that he had taken a breath, and in that divine inhalation had momentarily drawn his own light back into himself. The fragility of the Imperium, a truth usually buried under mountains of dogma and bureaucratic inertia, was laid bare in those 3 seconds. The empire of 1,000,000 worlds was not held together by battleships and regiments, but by a single, flickering psychic flame. That flame had wavered, and in the ensuing silence the entire edifice had groaned, its foundations shaken to the core. Navigators, the most vital and isolated of humanity's servants, became oracles of doom or prophets of rebirth, their every twitch and tremor scrutinized for meaning. The safe passage between stars, the very lifeblood of the imperial machine, was revealed not as a granted certainty, but as a fragile prayer endlessly repeated that had, for one terrifying moment, gone unanswered. The air of the grand cathedral on the shrine world of Sanctus Caelum was thick with incense, and the murmured prayers of 10,000 pilgrims, a heady perfume of devotion that clung to the gilded arches and stained glass windows depicting the Emperor's 10,000 years of sacrifice. High Priest Alaric stood at the towering marble pulpit, his voice a resonant instrument of absolute conviction, echoing through the cavernous space. He spoke of the God Emperor's eternal vigil, of his boundless love enduring an agony beyond comprehension to shield humanity from the darkness. His words were polished stones, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, and they fell upon the congregation with the comforting weight of absolute truth. Alaric's hands, raised in benediction, did not tremble. His face, framed by the ornate gold of his vestments, was a mask of serene authority. He was the rock upon which the faith of this world was built, a living conduit to the divine. Yet, beneath the golden cope and the layers of ritual, a different man existed. Alone in his private chambers after the day's final service, the mask fell away. The silence here was not filled with prayer, but with the whispering ghosts of his own thoughts. He would stand before the great arched window, looking out at the sprawling pilgrim city glowing in the twilight, and feel the foundations of his belief shift like sand. For weeks now, the reports had been trickling in, brought to him by his most trusted deacons. A pilgrim from the agri-world of Viridia, a simple farmer with dirt still under his nails, claimed the statue of the Emperor in the cathedral's lower vaults had wept tears of liquid gold, healing his withered leg. A young Schola initiate, feverish and near death from the blight, swore a figure of pure light had stood at her bedside, its touch cooling her brow and restoring her to health. Alaric had initially dismissed these accounts as the fervent imaginings of the overly devout, the simple minds of the masses grasping for tangible miracles, but they persisted, multiplying. They were no longer just tales of healing. They were visions of a golden figure walking amongst the throngs, of a voice that spoke not in high Gothic scripture, but in the intimate language of the individual soul. These were not the distant, sanctioned miracles of the imperial creed. They were personal, immediate, and terrifyingly alive. They spoke of an emperor who was not a silent, suffering corpse on a distant throne, but a present, active force. And that possibility, that glorious, terrifying possibility, struck at the very core of everything Alaric had preached his entire life. The core tenet of the imperial faith was the emperor's eternal sacrifice. He was the corpse god on the golden throne, a perpetual martyr whose silent suffering was the price for humanity's survival. It was a faith built on stasis, on a tragedy 10 millennia old. It was a faith that gave the ecclesiarchy its purpose, its power, its very reason for being. But what if the core of the story was wrong? What if he was not a silent, static god, but a waking one? The question was a spike of ice in Alaric's heart. To entertain it was heresy of the highest order, a thought crime that could see him burned at the stake. It meant that the entire ecclesiastical structure, the vast, intricate machine of which he was a senior cog, was built upon a fundamental misunderstanding. His life's work, his very identity, was predicated on a God who suffered in silence. A God who awoke was a God who might speak, who might judge, who might find the priesthood itself wanting. He found himself standing before the small, personal shrine in his chamber, a simple relic of a saint encased in crystal. He tried to pray, to seek the comforting numbness of ritual, but the words felt like ashes in his mouth. All he could see were the hopeful, desperate faces of the pilgrims, their faith renewed by these strange signs. And all he could feel was a cold, creeping fear. Was he, the high priest, the only one whose faith was faltering? Was his doubt a failure of his own spirit, a weakness in the face of the divine? Or was it the first, rational tremor of a world about to be unmade? The conflict tore at him, a silent civil war waged in the fortress of his soul. He was the guardian of a flame that had burned unchanged for 10,000 years, and now he was terrified that the source of that flame was not only alive, but was beginning to breathe, threatening to either extinguish it forever or ignite a conflagration that would consume the galaxy. The mud of Calthax Prime was a cold, sucking grave, and the air tasted of ozone and rusted metal. For Guardsman Kalen, the war had long since blurred into a numb cycle of advance, dig in, and endure. His world was the trench, his horizon the next shattered hab-block, his liturgy the staccato rhythm of La's fire and the deeper boom of artillery. He huddled with his squad, the 57th Cadian, in a waterlogged crater, the rain a constant gray drizzle that found every gap in their flak armor. They were waiting for the next orc rush, a tide of green muscle and mindless violence that had been grinding their regiment to dust for months. Fear was a familiar companion, a cold stone in his gut, but now it was edged with a weary resignation. This mud, this noise, this endless dying, this was all there was and all there ever would be. Then it happened, not with a sound but with a feeling. A warmth bloomed in Kalen's chest, sudden and inexplicable, spreading through his limbs like strong amasuk. The pervasive chill that had seeped into his bones vanished, replaced by a vital, humming energy. The constant, grinding fear evaporated, not replaced by the battle rage of combat stims, but by a profound and crystalline clarity. The world seemed to sharpen, the details thrown into stark relief. The individual rivulets of water tracing paths down the crater's edge, the determined set of his. Sergeant's jaw, the faint, golden glint of the Imperial Aquila etched on his own lasgun stock. It felt as if a dense fog had lifted from his mind, revealing a landscape of pure purpose. In that moment, the chaos of the battlefield resolved into a simple, undeniable truth. He was an Imperial Guardsman, and his duty was to stand and fight. He had been taught since childhood that the Emperor protected. It was a phrase etched on every wall, recited in every schola lesson, a comforting abstraction for a distant, silent God. But this feeling was not abstract. This was a direct, personal infusion of strength, a divine hand steadying his own. There was no other explanation his mind could grasp. The Emperor, from his golden throne, had reached across the unimaginable gulf of space and touched him, a single, insignificant soldier in an ocean of mud and blood. All washed over him, so potent it threatened to buckle his knees. Without conscious thought, he rose from his crouch. Mud dripped from his coat as he stood to his full height, ignoring the questioning looks from his squadmates. He raised his lasgun, clutching it to his chest, the cold metal now feeling like a sacred relic. His voice, usually lost in the din of war, rang out clear and strong, cutting through the percussive background of the battlefield. "I swear my loyalty to the Golden Throne," he declared, the words of the imperial oath flowing from him not as a rote recitation, but as a living vow. "I pledge my life to the God Emperor. I shall bear my arms in his holy name, and I shall fear no evil, for my faith is my shield." The effect on his squad was instantaneous. The weary, haunted looks vanished from their faces, replaced by a dawning fire. They saw Kalen, a man they knew to be as tired and scared as any of them, transformed. His posture was unyielding, his eyes blazed with a conviction that seemed to cast its own light in the gloom. One by one, they rose beside him, their own voices joining his, a ragged chorus of devotion that swelled into a defiant roar. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran who had seen 100 such oaths broken on 100 different worlds, felt a lump form in his own throat. He had not felt such pure, uncomplicated faith since he was a boy. What Kalen felt as divine favor was, in truth, the outer ripple of a far greater event. The sudden surge of courage, the mental clarity, it was a raw, untapped psionic awakening, a spark ignited by the immense psychic shockwave emanating from a stirring Terra. He was a conduit, unknowingly channeling a fragment of the Emperor's reawakening power, a human antenna receiving a signal meant for the galaxy. As the squad's renewed fervor solidified their defensive line, a strange phenomenon occurred. A charging mob of orcs, mere meters from their position, faltered. The beasts, sensitive to the crude psychic resonance of a good fight, hesitated in the face of this sudden, focused wall of human will. They snarled and beat their chests. But their wahog, energy for a crucial second, sputtered against the invisible field of resolve the guardsmen now projected. The line held. Kalen saw only the Emperor's protection. He did not see the invisible tide of psychic energy he had momentarily ridden, a tiny, human-scale echo of the cataclysm brewing at the heart of the Imperium. The chamber was a fortress within a fortress, a sanctum buried so deep within the imperial palace that the very air felt ancient and heavy with secrets. Here, far from the public piety and the marching armies, the true engine of the Imperium convened. The 12 High Lords of Terra sat around a great obsidian table, its surface polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the grim, powerful faces of those who guided a million worlds. There were no banners, no ostentatious displays of rank. The power in this room was a quiet, terrible thing, worn as comfortably as a well-fitted shroud. The only light came from a single, hooded lumen globe suspended. Overhead, casting deep shadows that pooled in the corners of the room like gathering conspiracies, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, a man whose uniform was a tapestry of campaign ribbons and whose face was a roadmap of grim decisions, broke the silence. His voice was low, gravelly, devoid of the orator's flourish used for the masses. He spoke of the astronomicans' flicker not as a miracle or an omen, but as a catastrophic systems failure. He detailed the dozens of ships lost, the supply lines severed, the military campaigns thrown into disarray by a 3-second lapse in the one constant upon which all imperial strategy depended. For him, the event was not theological. It was a stark vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the Imperium that its enemies would be all too eager to exploit. His proposal was one of brute force contingency, the mobilization of the battle fleet Solar, the fortification of the Manville points around Terra, a state of readiness that bordered on outright paranoia. Across the table, the ecclesiarch, a figure whose vestments seemed to drink the light, responded with a voice like polished silk over steel. He acknowledged the temporal concerns but framed the flicker as a divine sign, a tremor in the firmament of faith. He spoke of the widespread reports from his clergy, the visions, the miracles, the renewed fervor sweeping the pilgrim routes. To him, the astronomican's momentary failure was not a weakness, but a breath held by a galaxy in anticipation. He cautioned against a response born of fear, arguing that to militarize in the face of potential divine intervention was itself a form of heresy. Perhaps, he suggested, these signs were not a threat to their power, but an invitation to reshape the Imperium, to forge a new covenant with a waking God. His words were carefully chosen, but the ambition beneath them was a palpable force, the ambition of a church poised to become the sole interpreter of a living deity. The tension between the two perspectives thickened the air. The master of the administratum saw a bureaucratic nightmare of recalibrated tithe grades and reassessed planetary compliance. The paternal envoy of the navigators spoke of the panic in his houses, the demand for answers he could not provide. The debate swirled, a dance of power and fear disguised as policy. The flicker of the astronomican and the psychic disturbances were a Rorschach test upon which each lord projected their own ambitions and anxieties. Some saw the crumbling of 10,000 years of careful control. Others, like the ecclesiarch, saw the dust shaking from a throne and a once-in-an-epoch chance to be the hand that helped a god to rise, securing their own legacy for the next 10 millennia. The obsidian table was no longer just a piece of furniture. It had become a fault line, and the first tremors of a schism were already beginning to rumble through the heart of the Imperium's power. The careful veneer of statesmanship shattered like glass. The Lord Commander's fist slammed onto the obsidian table, the sharp crack echoing in the tense silence. His face, a mask of controlled fury, was turned fully upon the ecclesiarch. He denounced the notion of a waking emperor not as a blessing, but as the single greatest threat to imperial stability since the Horus heresy. An awake emperor would be a sovereign, a general, a will, not a symbol. He would command, he would judge, he would overturn 10 millennia of precedent and law. The entire structure of the Imperium, from the Departamento Munitorum to the Officio Assassinorum, was built to serve a silent god. A speaking one would render most of it obsolete, and its masters powerless. The Lord Commander's faction, comprised of the military and logistical lords, saw only the collapse of the chain of command, the dissolution of their hard-won authority into the whims of a being whose mind no mortal could hope to comprehend. The ecclesiarch's response was a study in venomous calm. He accused the Lord Commander of idolizing the machinery of power over the divine source of it. He painted a picture of a renewed Imperium, purged of its stagnation and corruption by the living will of its God, a golden age dawning from the very throne room itself. His allies, the representatives of the Adeptus Ministorum and the more zealous members of the council, leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with a frightening fervor. They spoke of the ecclesiarchy's sacred duty to guide the faithful through this transition, to become the voice of a waking God on a million pulpits. Their power, derived from interpreting the words of a silent deity, would only be magnified if that deity began to speak, and they were the ones holding the quill. Between these two burgeoning schisms, the other high lords scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. The master of the administratum saw his vast, labyrinthine bureaucracy, the true, inertial government of the Imperium, being swept aside by either a military junta or a theocratic dictatorship. The inquisitorial representatives saw the potential for a purge of unimaginable scale, whether ordered by a newly militant emperor or initiated by a panicked Lord Commander. The air grew thick with accusation and counter-accusation, the common good of the Imperium forgotten in the frantic scramble to secure personal influence and survival. The obsidian table was no longer a fault line. It was a chasm, and the figures around it were already choosing their sides on the precipice. The sacred duty of governing mankind had devolved into a naked, terrified struggle for power, revealing the grim truth that the Imperium was not sustained by faith or loyalty, but by a precarious balance of fear and self-interest that was now, terrifyingly, about to be broken. It began not in the halls of power or the sanctuaries of the faithful, but in the unrecorded spaces where common humanity slept. Across 1,000 worlds, from the spire tops of hive cities to the dust-choked farmsteads of agri-worlds, the same dream descended upon the masses. It was a shared vision that bypassed language and creed, etching itself directly onto the sleeping mind. A vast, silent throne room, impossibly grand, and upon a seat of impossible complexity, a figure of pure, blazing gold beginning to rise. There were no features, no defining details, only the overwhelming impression of majesty and power, of an ancient force stirring from an ageless slumber. The dream was a silent, psychic broadcast, and its reception was a litmus test for the soul of the Imperium. In the cramped hab unit of a Factorum worker on the industrial world of Cycladia, the dream was a deliverance. For Milos, whose life was a gray smear of 16-hour shifts, nutrient-paced meals, and the constant, bone-deep ache of labor, the golden figure was a promise. He woke with tears drying on his soot-stained cheeks, a feeling of warmth lingering in his chest like swallowed sunlight. The hopelessness that had been his constant companion had vanished, replaced by a fierce, inexplicable joy. The God Emperor was not a distant, suffering icon. He was awakening, and his gaze was turning upon his people. That day, Milos did not trudge to his post. He walked, his head held high, a strange serenity insulating him from the Factorum's din. He spoke to his fellow workers of the golden dream, and a spark, long dormant, kindled in their eyes. A pilgrimage was born not from doctrine, but from desperate hope. They began to gather, these simple laborers, abandoning their machines to seek the local cathedral. A quiet exodus of the faithful who believed salvation was not an abstract concept for the afterlife, but a tangible event unfolding in the present. But on the feudal world of Ethelberg, the same dream brought only terror. To the serfs who toiled in the shadow of their knightly lords, divinity was synonymous with judgment. The local preachers spoke endlessly of the emperor's wrath, of the purging fire that awaited the unfaithful and the unclean. When the dream came to a young farmhand named Anya, the rising golden figure was not a savior but an executioner. She saw in its faceless radiance not benevolence but an implacable final verdict. She woke screaming, convinced she had been marked for divine retribution. Her terror was a contagion, spreading through the mud hut village. The dream, they whispered, was a warning. The God Emperor was awakening to pass sentence on a sinful galaxy. Panic curdled into violence. A mob, armed with scythes and torches, descended upon the manor of their lord, believing his opulence to be the sin that had drawn the divine eye. They were not seeking salvation, but trying to appease a wrathful God with a preemptive sacrifice, their riot a frantic, bloody prayer for mercy. The dream's impact was as varied as humanity itself. In the bustling market plazas of mercantile hubs, traders interpreted the golden figure as a sign of a new, prosperous age, sparking a frenzy of speculation and investment. On war-torn planets, soldiers on both sides of the conflict saw the figure rising with a sword of fire, each claiming the omen for their own cause, fueling fresh waves of fanatical attacks. The very fabric of daily life was being rewoven by this shared nocturnal experience. The imperial creed, once a monolithic, top-down institution, fractured into a billion personal interpretations. The authorities were powerless to stop it. How could one arrest a dream? How could one excommunicate a feeling? The galaxy was becoming a mirror, and the dream of gold was the light shone upon it. In some places, it revealed a deep, yearning need for a father's return, sparking movements of peaceful devotion and renewed purpose. In others, it illuminated a festering pool of fear and guilt, unleashing chaos and self-destruction. The collective unconscious of mankind was stirring, and whether it dreamed of a messiah or a judge, the result was the same. The stagnant pond of Imperial life had been struck by a stone, and the ripples were now crashing upon every shore, heralding an age of either miracles or madness. The silence of the throne room was a sacred artifact, preserved for 10,000 years. It was a texture woven from the low, ozone hum of the Golden Throne's arcane machinery, the soft hiss of recycled air, and the whispered prayers of the custodian guard who stood their eternal vigil. That silence was as much a part of the imperial faith as the Aquila or the catechisms of sacrifice. It was the sound of a god's enduring pain, a quiet so profound it had become a presence in its own right. Then, without warning, the silence broke. It began not as a sound, but as a vibration, a deep, subsonic tremor that traveled up through the polished obsidian floor and into the auramite boots of the custodians. It was a feeling of tectonic plates shifting in a place where no geology existed. A moment later, the noise followed, a low, grinding groan, like a mountain of granite being forced to move after eons of stillness, emanated from the very heart of the Golden Throne. It was a sound of immense, protesting strain, of metal older than empires being asked to perform a function it had long forgotten. The custodian on the central dais, Brother Sentinel Cassian, did not startle. His training was far too absolute for that. But his grip on his guardian spear tightened imperceptibly, his knuckles bleaching white beneath his gauntlets. His enhanced hearing, usually tuned to filter out the throne's constant, ritualized hum, was now completely dominated by this new, terrifying voice. Across the chamber, the tech priests attending the throne's arcane peripherals froze. Their mechadendrites, which had been performing the same minute calibrations for centuries, hung motionless in the air. Their binary cant, a constant stream of data and devotion, ceased midstream. Glowing red optic lenses swiveled from their consoles to fix upon the central edifice, their mechanical minds struggling to process an event for which they had no precedent. The groan deepened, resonating through the bones of the palace itself, a bass note of awakening that seemed to shake the dust of millennia from the high, gilded arches. Sensors that had monitored the throne's vital signs with unblinking consistency for 10,000 years suddenly screamed with silent, internal alarms. Energy readings, which had been a flat, predictable line since the time of the heresy, spiked into jagged, unknown territories. Waves of psionic power, raw and untamed, pulsed from the enthroned form, causing the air to shimmer with heat haze and the scent of ozone to sharpen into something acrid, like lightning-struck stone. The golden light that perpetually haloed the Emperor did not brighten, but it thickened, becoming a viscous, luminous fog that swirled with phantom shapes and half-glimpsed memories of a bygone age. The air in the throne room became heavy, charged with an awe so potent it felt like a physical weight on the shoulders. For the custodians, this was the core of their existence, the object of their unshakable faith, making a sound they had never heard, exhibiting a power they had never witnessed. It was the moment their deepest, most forbidden hope collided with a primal, instinctual fear. The machinery of immortality, the sacred engine that sustained the Imperium, was not just functioning, it was stirring. The groan was not a sound of failure, but of reanimation, and in its grinding, ancient voice, it spoke of an end to the long, silent vigil and the terrifying, glorious dawn of something entirely new. For 10,000 years, consciousness had been a flat, burning plain, an endless, scorching desert of pain where time had no meaning, only the constant, agonizing necessity of holding back the tide. It was an existence of pure will, a fortress mind maintaining a billion psychic shields against the howling madness of the warp. A lighthouse keeper eternally fueling the Astronomican's blaze while chained to the pyre. There was no past, no future, only the eternal screaming now. But then a crack appeared in the monolithic agony, not a lessening of the pain, but a fissure through which something else could bleed. A memory, sharp and unbidden, pierced the static of suffering. Not a thought, but a sensory ghost. The smell of ozone and blood on a world called Ullener, the weight of a sword in a hand that was not yet dust and bone, the roar of legions chanting a name that was now only a forgotten title. The flash was gone as quickly as it came, but it left a scar on the endless now. Another followed, the cold, bitter taste of betrayal, the sight of a beloved son's face twisted by demonic spite, the psychic scream of a galaxy tearing itself apart. The Horus Heresy, a wound that never healed, replayed not as a narrative, but as a series of raw, emotional shards, grief, fury, and a love for humanity so vast it had become its own kind of torture. These fragments of a life before the throne were the first stirrings. They were sparks falling on the tinder of a mind that had been forced to be a machine for millennia, and with the sparks came new sensations, bleeding in from the outside. The Emperor, a psychic being of incalculable power, began to feel the galaxy again. It was not a clear perception, but a vast, roaring symphony of emotion. He felt the desperate, grinding faith of trillions, a river of devotion that flowed toward him, each prayer a tiny, flickering candle adding its light to the inferno of his being. But intertwined with that faith was a galaxy of suffering, the terror of the guardsmen in the mud, the despair of the hive-world scum, the lonely fear of the astropath lost in the Empyrean. It was a burden, heavier than the pain of the throne itself, the collective anguish of the species he had sought to shepherd. This influx of feeling, of memory and shared sensation, coalesced into a single monumental purpose. The long vigil had been a defense, a holding action against extinction. But this was different. This was an impetus, a forward motion. The will that had been focused entirely on stasis began to turn, like a vast stone sphere grinding on an axis unused for eons. It was not a decision, for the mind was not yet capable of such discrete things. It was an instinct, a deep, cellular imperative that resonated with the very first purpose he had ever known: to guide, to lead, to shape the destiny of man. And then, within the prison of his own physical form, a flicker. A neural impulse, long suppressed by the throne's life-sustaining machinery, traveled a pathway that had been dormant for 100 centuries. It was not a movement of a limb, for the body was too ruined for that. It was a tremor, a minute shift in the psychic potential that bound his desiccated flesh to the golden machinery. A single, carbonized nerve ending fired. A finger, skeletal, and fused to the armrest by centuries of psychic discharge, did not move, but the potential for movement, the ghost of an intention, shimmered around it for a single, impossible moment. After 10,000 years of perfect, agonizing stillness, the Emperor of mankind had stirred. A tremor, subtle as a dying star's last pulse, rippled through the foundations of reality, and the great players on the galactic stage, each attuned to a different frequency of existence, felt the shift in their bones, their souls, their very essence. In the fetid underbellies of hive cities and on demon worlds drenched in blasphemy, the cultists of the dark gods paused in their sanguine rites. The familiar, seductive whispers of their patrons, which usually dripped like poison into their minds, faltered. The chorus of the warp, a symphony of rage, desire, decay, and ambition, was marred by a single, discordant note of unease. The ruinous powers, eternal and capricious, turned their ineffable attention toward the Sol system, not with their customary hunger, but with a wary, ancient recognition. The long game was changing, and the certainty of entropy was being challenged by the possibility of a renewed, singular will. Their mortal followers, sensing this divine disquiet, felt their fanaticism curdle into a frantic, desperate fervor, their rituals becoming more extreme, more bloody, as if they could drown out the approaching silence with a crescendo of sacrifice. In the twilight realms of the craft worlds, where spirit stones glimmered like captive stars, the farseers trembled. Their intricate runes of fate, cast upon wraithbone tables, swirled in patterns unseen for 30,000 years. The endless, branching paths of the future, which for so long had led only to varying shades of extinction, were now converging, twisted by a gravity well of immense potential. They saw the Monkeith's corpse king not as a static icon, but as a variable, a sun threatening to go supernova or collapse into a deeper blackness. For a race whose entire existence was a desperate navigation away from the predations of she who thirsts, this was not a prophecy of salvation, but of catastrophic upheaval. The delicate balance of the galaxy, terrible as it was the only board upon which they could play their long game of survival. A waking emperor was a wild card, a force that could shatter the board entirely, offering either a new ally against the great enemy or a new, even more implacable foe. The air in their domed sear chambers grew cold with a tension that had not been felt since the fall. Even the orcs, those simple, brutal engines of war, felt the shift in a way their crude psychology could not articulate. The Wahag, energy, the collective psychic field generated by their belief and their love of a good fight, stuttered. A knob in the midst of a roaring charge against Imperial lines suddenly hesitated, his choppa pausing mid-swing as a strange, unfamiliar feeling passed through the gestalt. It wasn't fear, orcs knew no fear, but a sense of a bigger, better fight brewing somewhere else, a fight so monumental it made the current scrap feel like a petty squabble. The war bosses bellowed with renewed fury, not out of strategy, but from an instinctive need to rally the psychic power of their hordes to build their Wahag to a level that could compete with the immense, gathering presence they sensed light years away. The greenskin tide became more focused, more frenzied, as if drawn by a psychic scent of the ultimate conflict. Across the silent, watchful domains of the Necron dynasties, tomb sensors registered an anomalous spike in the background psychic resonance of the galaxy. For beings who had severed their connection to the warp, it was a data point of immense interest and potential threat. The Silent King, pondering the great work of biotransference's reversal, calculated new probabilities. The Tiao Empire's ethereals, receiving garbled reports from their human auxiliaries, spoke of a potential galactic paradigm shift and quietly redirected expansion spheres, sensing both unprecedented risk and opportunity. In the dark between the stars, Tyranid hive minds adjusted their course by microns, the shadow in the warp they cast twitching as it registered a new, brilliant point of light flaring to life. From the deepest hell to the highest seer's chamber, from the mindless horde to the calculating machine, the galaxy held its breath. The great, grinding gears of conflict and survival, which had turned with a terrible predictability for 10,000 years, had momentarily jammed. Every being, from the lowest cultist to the most ancient star god, sensed it, the precipice upon which existence now trembled. They were all waiting, their fates suspended in the silent, golden space between one heartbeat and the next, anticipating the monumental event that would not merely change the balance of power, but redefine the very nature of reality itself. The sanctum of the final catechism was a vault of whispered power, a chamber hidden deep within the labyrinthine spires of the Grand Ministorum on Terra. Here, far from the public adoration and the echoing hymns of the faithful, the highest echelons of the ecclesiarchy gathered. They were not priests here, but princes of a theocracy that spanned the galaxy, their vestments of cloth of gold and crimson silk seeming to absorb the dim light from the single, massive stained glass window depicting the emperor's sacrifice. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment, sanctified oils, and the cold, metallic tang of fear. For days, the reports had flooded in the dreams, the miracles, the astronomicons flicker, the thrones groan, and now, the most senior cardinals and confessors sat in a tense circle, the very foundations of their faith cracking beneath their feet. Cardinal Ignatius, his face a roadmap of devout wrinkles, slammed a heavy, date-encrusted tome onto the obsidian table. His voice, usually a soothing instrument for masses of millions, was raw with a fervent, terrifying hope. He spoke of the signs not as anomalies, but as a divine chorus, the prelude to a second great crusade led by a living, breathing God. He argued for a proclamation of glorious renewal, for the ecclesiarchy to lead the faithful in a global jubilee, to prepare the imperial soul for the embrace of its awakened master. His eyes shone with the light of a man who saw his lifelong devotion culminating in a personal audience with the divine. To him, the waking emperor was the ultimate validation of every prayer, every hymn, every drop of incense burned over 10,000 years. Opposite him, Cardinal Hester, a man whose gaunt frame seemed carved from the same cold stone as his seat, steepled his fingers. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dust settling on forgotten dogma. He acknowledged the signs but framed them as a theological cataclysm. The imperial creed, he reminded them, was built upon the bedrock of the emperor's eternal sacrifice. He was the suffering God, the perpetual martyr whose silent agony was the price of humanity's survival. It was a faith of stasis, of a finished story. A waking emperor was an unfinished sentence, and the church, which had built its entire empire on interpreting his silence, would be rendered obsolete by his speech. What need was there for priests, for cardinals, for an entire adeptus, if God himself walked among them and issued his own commands? The power of the ministorum, he argued, was a derivative power, and its source was about to reclaim it. The schism tore through the sanctum, invisible yet as sharp as a power blade. Bishops and deacons, their faces pale, aligned themselves with one cardinal or the other. The room fractured into two warring camps. One side saw a glorious rebirth, a chance to be the voice of a living God, their authority magnified beyond measure as the sole interpreters of his renewed will. The other saw only the collapse of meaning, the evaporation of their purpose, and the terrifying prospect of a divine audit of an institution that had, over 10 millennia, accumulated vast wealth, political influence, and doctrinal corruption. They feared a God who might look upon his church and find it wanting, a judgment from which there could be no appeal. The debate raged, stripping away the layers of ritual and piety to reveal the raw nerve of institutional survival. The question was no longer one of faith, but of function. Could a church built to venerate a corpse adapt to serve a living king? Or would it, in its desperate attempt to retain control, be forced to declare its own God a heretic to its own teachings? The sanctum of the final catechism, designed for the affirmation of absolute truth, had become the breeding ground for the most profound heresy of all. The terrifying possibility that the God they worshipped was about to return, and that his return would mean the end of everything they had built in his name. The tremors shaking the foundations of the Imperium were not felt as terror or theological crisis by all. In the shadowed corners of the galaxy, far from the echoing halls of Terra and the sanctums of the ecclesiarchy, the signs of awakening were read not as a threat, but as a promise. For those who had long chafed under the boot of imperial dogma and bureaucratic stagnation, the stirrings from the throne were the first cracks of light in a sky of unending twilight. They were the herald of a potential new dawn, a chance to shatter 10,000 years of tyranny and build something new from the rubble. Aboard the rogue trader vessel Stellar Marauder, Captain Lysandra Valeria stood on her command bridge, her sharp eyes scanning the star chart hololith. The reports of the Astronomicons' flicker and the widespread psychic phenomena had not caused her panic, but a fierce, calculating excitement. For generations, her dynasty had navigated the fringes of imperial space. Their warren of trade a fragile shield against the suffocating grasp of the Adeptus Terra. They had seen the waste, the inefficiency, the sheer stupidity of an empire too vast and too rigid to adapt. They had traded with Xenos, skirted the dictates of the Inquisition, and watched as promising worlds were bled dry by the Imperium's insatiable tides. Now, as the astropathic choirs whispered of the Emperor's stirring, Lysandra saw a galaxy of opportunity unfolding. A weakened, distracted, or even reformed central authority could mean the loosening of the imperial grip. The Great Warp routes, once the sole domain of the navigator houses and the imperial navy, could become true highways of commerce, open to anyone with a stout ship and a bold heart. She envisioned a galaxy not of enforced isolation and dogma, but of free trade, of alliances forged for profit rather than fear, where human ingenuity could flourish untrammeled by the dead hand of the administratum. The awakening was not a divine event to her. It was a market correction of cosmic proportions. On the agri-world of Veridia Secundus, planetary governor Arcturus Minsk received the same reports in the quiet of his family's ancient estate. The manor house, built from local timber and stone, stood in stark contrast to the blocky, utilitarian structures imposed by the imperial governor it had replaced centuries before. Minsk's family had always ruled Veridia, even before the Great Crusade had reclaimed it, and they had always resented the distant, uncaring masters on Terra who took their grain and gave back only demands and prayers. The recent miracles, the weeping statues, the healing visions reported by the local pilgrims, were not evidence of divine favor to him, but symptoms of a system under terminal stress. The imperial faith, the very glue that held the disparate worlds together, was softening, becoming pliable. As he walked the fields of golden gristwheat that stretched to the horizon, he felt the possibility like a change in the weather. If the God Emperor was truly awakening, would he care about the tithe quotas of a single agri-world? Would he even notice if one planet, one system, quietly reasserted its ancient sovereignty? The Imperial Guard regiments were stretched thin. The battle fleet was surely preoccupied with the crisis at the heart of the Empire. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. Minsk began to quietly meet with his most trusted generals and the leaders of the planet's militia. He spoke not of rebellion, but of preparedness, of the need for Veridia to be able to stand on its own feet should the unthinkable happen and the light of Terra finally flicker out. He dreamed not of a galaxy-spanning empire, but of a free Veridia, its fate back in the hands of its own people. These sparks of hope were igniting across the Imperium. In the smog-choked underhives, rebellion leaders who had fought a losing guerrilla war for generations felt a new surge of confidence. The enforcers were nervous, the Arbites distracted by reports of celestial events. The monolithic certainty of imperial control was wavering. On Forge worlds, radical tech priests saw a chance to throw off the shackles of the Mechanicus' dogmatic quest for knowledge and pursue true innovation, unfettered by ancient ritual. For every citizen who trembled at the thought of a waking emperor, there was another who saw in his stirring the potential for liberation from millennia of oppression, stagnation, and fear. They did not worship a god, they hoped for a revolution. The long, dark night of the Imperium had lasted for 10,000 years, but now, on the far horizon, the most dangerous and intoxicating of all possibilities was beginning to glow, the promise of a new dawn. For every soul who saw a liberator in the stirring golden light, another saw only a judge, a tyrant, or an annihilator. The same divine presence that promised renewal to some whispered of absolute, final judgment to others. As the signs multiplied, a parallel wave of terror began to crest, a chilling counterpoint to the burgeoning hope, revealing the dark, suffocating underbelly of faith built on 10,000 years of fear. The God Emperor was not just a savior. He was the master of the greatest military force in history, the architect of a secular imperium that his own church had twisted into a theocracy of fire and blood. What would such a being do upon waking? Would he be the benevolent father from ancient myth, or the unforgiving general who had once purged entire worlds for disobedience? The uncertainty was a poison seeping into the veins of the Imperium. In the fortress monastery of the Ordo Hereticus on Scintilla, Inquisitor Valerius Costableum pored over data slates filled with reports of miracles and mass visions. To his analytical, paranoid mind, These were not blessings, but the opening moves in a coming purge of unimaginable scale. He knew his history, the true history buried beneath the hagiography. The emperor of the Great Crusade had been a being of immense, ruthless will, intolerant of religion, psychers, and any deviation from his grand design. An awake emperor would look upon the modern Imperium, a sprawling, superstitious empire ruled by a powerful church he had explicitly forbidden, and see a monument to failure. Costebon saw the future in fire. The ecclesiarchy would be the first to burn. Its cardinals and confessors declared heretics for the very faith they preached. The imperial cult itself would be dismantled, and the ensuing civil war would make the Horus heresy look like a border skirmish. He began quietly, methodically, preparing his own power base, securing black site facilities and loyal stormtrooper cadres. He was not preparing to serve a waking god, but to survive his wrath, or even, in the darkest corners of his mind, to oppose a tyrant whose return might be the true apocalypse. This dread was not confined to the rarefied heights of the Inquisition. In the cramped, multi-level hab blocks of the hive world of Necromunda, the common citizenry lived in a state of escalating panic. Their entire worldview was built upon a simple, terrifying equation. The emperor was a god. Gods demanded obedience, and failure to obey meant eternal damnation. The preachers in the underhive chapels, who had always emphasized his wrath and judgment over his mercy, now found their sermons taking on a terrifying new relevance. The groaning of the Golden Throne, transmitted through garbled astropathic dispatches, became the grinding of a celestial prison door. The shared dreams of a golden figure were not visions of hope, but premonitions of being personally judged by a being whose gaze could see every stolen crust of bread, every muttered curse, every moment of doubt. A frantic, superstitious fervor took hold. Flagellant cults, once a fringe element, swelled in number, their members whipping their own backs raw in a desperate attempt to atone for sins. Before it was too late, people denounced their neighbors for minor infractions, hoping to curry favor with the returning deity by proving their zeal. The social fabric, already frayed, began to tear under the strain of a collective, terrified anticipation of divine wrath. On more civilized worlds, the terror was more philosophical but no less profound. Scholars and logicians who studied the imperial truth saw the awakening as an existential crisis. The emperor's original vision had been one of reason and science, a path for humanity to master the galaxy without the crutch of faith. His enforced silence had allowed that dream to die, replaced by the very superstition he had fought to eradicate. Would he, upon waking, seek to reforge mankind in that cold, rational image? Would he see the trillions of faithful not as devoted children, but as deluded primitives in need of forcible re-education? The comfort of faith, the very thing that had given meaning to countless lives in a cruel universe, might itself be declared the ultimate heresy. The return of their God could mean the annihilation of everything that gave their suffering meaning. This pervasive fear coalesced into a stark, apocalyptic interpretation. In secret gatherings and on illicit datanets, a new prophecy spread. The emperor's awakening was not the beginning of a new age, but the end of the current one. It was the final, terrible sunset before the long night. The God of mankind was rising not to save his creation, but to end it, to pass a final verdict on a species that had failed him. The golden light was not the dawn, but the fire of a crematorium pyre, vast enough to consume the galaxy. This was the true terror of God, not his absence, but his imminent, overwhelming, and potentially unforgiving presence. The hope of liberation and the fear of annihilation were two sides of the same coin, spinning in the air, and a terrified galaxy waited to see upon which face it would land. The first domino fell on the forge world of Griffon IV. For 10,000 years, its orbital defense platforms had cycled through the same flawless patterns. their machine spirits placid and predictable, their gun crews drilling with metronomic precision. Their faith was not in a distant god, but in the certainty of routine, the unshakable logic of the Omnissiah's designs. Then, a junior tech acolyte, his mind addled by the shared dream of a golden figure, misinterpreted a sensor ghost as a demonic incursion. In a panic, he bypassed his superiors and triggered a full system-wide alert. The defense grid, its protocols interlocked with the fervency of its operators, reacted with catastrophic speed. Platforms opened fire on each other, identifying their sister stations as corrupted entities in a self-replicating cascade of paranoia. Within an hour, the orbital shield that had guarded Griffon IV for millennia was a cloud of molten debris, and the world lay naked to the void. It was not an external attack that broke its defenses, but a crack in the collective, unthinking faith that had been its true armor. The collapse was viral, spreading through the Imperium's institutions like a psychic plague. On the garrison world of Casta, a regiment of the Imperial Guard, renowned for its discipline, refused orders to deploy. The soldiers, gripped by the apocalyptic interpretation of the Emperor's awakening, believed their mission to be a pointless exercise in a galaxy soon to be remade by divine fire. They barricaded themselves in their fortress monastery, praying and flagellating themselves, awaiting a judgment that never came from their commanding officers, who were too busy dealing with 3 other mutinies across the planet. The chain of command, that sacred article of imperial law, was not broken by an enemy bolter round, but by a theological dispute that rendered earthly authority meaningless. Morale, the invisible force that held the line against the darkness, evaporated. Naval captains found crew members huddled around makeshift shrines instead of their posts, more concerned with appeasing a waking god than maintaining plasma conduits. On frontier worlds, entire planetary governments simply stopped functioning, their bureaucrats and enforcers paralyzed by the existential question of whether their work mattered in the face of imminent apotheosis or annihilation. The Imperium was a machine that ran on certainty, the certainty of the Emperor's sacrifice, the certainty of the Imperial Creed, the certainty of duty. That certainty was gone, replaced by a galaxy of terrifying possibilities, and the machine was seizing up, its gears grinding against the sand of doubt. Rebellions, long simmering in the dark, now boiled over into the light, fueled by the sudden vacuum of authority. On the mining world of Styges, the workers, inspired by rumors of a new dawn of freedom, overthrew their overseers. They were not met with the swift, brutal retribution of the Adeptus Arbites, for the Arbites were themselves divided, some joining the revolt, others deserting to protect their own families from the impending chaos. The PDF forces sent to quell the uprising found their vehicles sabotaged by their own mechanics, who saw the act as a holy strike against a tyrannical system. The delicate ecosystem of control, a balance of fear, faith, and force maintained for 10 millennia, was disintegrating. The force was being neutered by a crisis of faith, and the fear had been redirected from imperial authority to the divine judgment of the Emperor himself. The Imperium was revealed not as a monolithic empire of steel and ceramite, but as a fragile consensus, a shared story told across 1,000,000 worlds. The story was that the Emperor suffered silently so that humanity might endure. It was a tragedy that demanded obedience, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. Now, the protagonist of that story was seemingly changing his role, and the narrative was collapsing. The faith that had been the bedrock of imperial unity was now the source of its fragmentation. The very belief that had lit the Astronomicon, inspired the guardsmen, and sanctified the priest had become a solvent, eating away at the bonds of loyalty, discipline, and order. The balance had not been tipped by an external foe, but shattered from within, by the terrifying, glorious, and utterly destabilizing possibility that the corpse god was no longer a corpse. It was not a voice, for it made no sound. It was not a vision, for it offered no image. It was a concept, pure and undiluted, blooming simultaneously in the minds of a select few across the galaxy, a psychic seed planted directly into the fertile soil of their consciousness. It carried no tone, no inflection, no hint of command or plea. It was simply, remember. The thought radiated from the still form on the golden throne, a single, focused burst of will that cut through the static of agony and the roar of the Astronomicon, delivered not as a shout, but as a whisper in the soul. In the throne room, custodian Brother Sentinel Cashin staggered, his guardian spear clattering against the polished floor, the first such lapse in his 2 centuries of vigil. The word echoed in his mind, a clarion call that resonated with the very core of his being. For him, a son of the Emperor's own genetic craft, remember was a summons to a forgotten oath. It spoke of a time before the silence, before the long watch, when the custodians were not just guardians of a sacred corpse, but the companions of a living king. It was a command to recall the imperial truth, the original grand design for humanity that had been lost in the fires of heresy and the ensuing age of blind faith. He saw flashes of the Great Crusade not as legend, but as memory, the Emperor walking among them, his voice a living thing, his will a tangible force shaping the galaxy. The word reforged his purpose. His duty was no longer just to guard a relic, it was to prepare for the return of a master. He looked upon the enthroned form and saw not a god to be venerated, but a general to be followed, and a wave of fierce, anticipatory loyalty washed over him, purer and more potent than any prayer. A system away on the shrine world of Sanctus Caelum, High Priest Alaric collapsed to his knees before his personal shrine, the single word crashing into his tumultuous thoughts. For him, remember was a divine indictment. It was a command to recall the original sin of his institution, the Lectitio Divinitatis, the faith that had sprouted in the Emperor's shadow against his explicit will. The word forced him to remember that the God he preached was a creation of mortals, a deification of a being who had rejected divinity. It was a demand to confront the 10,000-year lie upon which his power, his identity, and his entire world were built. The word did not bring him peace. It was a key turning in the lock of his doubt, opening a door to a terrifying void. Was he and all his kind heretic in the eyes of the awakening God? The command to remember felt like a prelude to being forgotten, and a sob of pure, theological terror escaped his lips. Aboard the rogue trader vessel Stellar Marauder, Captain Lysandra Valerius was reviewing a star chart when the thought blossomed in her mind with the force of a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the hololith to steady herself. For her, remember was a key to a lock she hadn't known existed. It carried the taste of ancient freedom, of a time before the Imperium's bureaucracy had ossified into a cage. She remembered stories, passed down in her family for generations, of the early days of exploration, when the galaxy was a realm of wonder and potential, not a charted territory to be managed and tithed. The word was not a call to faith, but a call to ambition. It whispered of the Emperor's original dream for a united, progressive humanity mastering the stars. In that moment, her desire for free trade and open routes transformed from mere profit-seeking into a sacred crusade, a return to a grander, more enlightened purpose that the waking emperor might himself endorse. On the war-torn fields of Calthax Prime, Guardsman Kaelin, his last gun warm from repelling the latest orc assault, felt the word settle over him like a mantle. For his simple, devout heart, remember was a benediction and a shield. It called him to remember the feeling that had surged through him in the crater, the clarity, the courage, the divine favor. It validated his experience, transforming his personal moment of faith into a universal truth. He remembered the faces of his squad, their renewed resolve, their shared oath. The word bound those moments together, solidifying his belief that the Emperor was not just stirring, but was actively reaching out to his faithful soldiers, fortifying them for the battles to come. It was a command to hold fast to that feeling, to make it the bedrock of his being in the chaotic times ahead. Across the galaxy, the single, identical thought spawned 1,000 different revolutions. An Archmagos on Mars remembered the promises of the Omnissiah and began recalculating all his models. A Farseer on a craft world remembered an ancient, half-forgotten alliance and felt a tremor of something that was not quite hope. A chaos sorcerer in the Eye of Terror remembered the face of his father before the fall, and for a single, agonizing second, his connection to the warp flickered. The Emperor's first word was not a solution, but a catalyst. It did not heal the fractures tearing the Imperium apart. It poured a new, volatile element into the cracks. It forced a confrontation with history, with identity, with the very meaning of faith and duty. It was a mirror held up to the soul of the galaxy, and in its silent, profound depths, every being saw reflected not what the Emperor was, but what they themselves had chosen to become. The upheaval was no longer just external. It had become a deeply personal, psychic civil war, ignited by a single, silent command from a god who had, after 10,000 years, finally spoken. In the quiet that followed the psychic tremor of that single, silent word, a deeper stillness fell across the galaxy, not the stillness of peace, but the hush of collective introspection. The great gears of war and faith had momentarily ceased their grinding, and in that suspended silence, individuals from the highest spire to the lowest underhive found themselves turning inward, pondering the fundamental question the awakening posed. What did it mean for the soul of humanity itself? Was this the long-awaited rebirth, the divine spring after an ice age of suffering? Or was it the final, elegant demise of the species, a glorious sunset before an eternal night? The answers were not found in dogma or decree, but in the silent, personal musings of countless souls, their shared anxieties painting a portrait of a species standing at the precipice of its own destiny. In his austere quarters, High Priest Alaric stared at his own reflection in the polished surface of his devotional helmet. The command to remember had scraped his soul raw, leaving him hollowed out and trembling. He saw in his own weary eyes the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of faith, and he wondered if it had all been a magnificent, beautiful error. Had humanity, in its desperate need for a father in the dark, created a god where none was intended? The potential rebirth offered by the Emperor's awakening felt, to him, like a death, the death of meaning, the death of the comforting story that had given structure to a chaotic universe. If the god was not a god, then the faith of quintillions was a shared delusion, and the sacrifices made in his name were a cosmic tragedy. His reflection seemed to mock him, the face of a man who had built his life on sand, watching as the tide of truth finally began to rise. Aboard her ship, Captain Lysandra Valerius watched the star flecked void, her mind a whirlwind of calculation and hope. For her, the question of humanity's soul was one of potential, long suppressed. The Imperium was a cage, its bars forged from fear and dogma. A rebirth would mean shattering those bars, allowing the human spirit to rediscover its innate curiosity, its courage, its capacity for growth. She saw not the death of a species, but the death of its self-imposed chains. The cost of this faith, she reflected, had been stagnation. For 10,000 years, humanity had traded its future for the security of a silent, suffering God. The price had been its soul, its creativity, its ambition, its very will to evolve. The stirring on the throne was an invoice come due, a chance to reclaim what had been lost, to pay a different price for a brighter destiny. It was a terrifying gamble, but to her, the alternative, the endless, silent continuation of the long, dark night, was a far more profound kind of death. On the battlefield of Calthex Prime, guardsman, Kalen cleaned his lasgun with ritual care, the memory of the Emperor's touch still a warm ember in his chest. His reflection on humanity was simpler, forged in mud and blood. He saw his species as a family, scattered and besieged, and the Emperor as its patriarch. The awakening was not a question of theology, but of family. It was the father rousing from a long slumber to protect his children. The cost of their faith had been paid in blood and obedience, a price he and countless others had given willingly. A rebirth meant the Father was finally coming to lead them, to end the long, lonely fight. The demise of humanity was unthinkable. It was the Xenos, the heretic, the mutant who faced demise. For Kalen, the soul of humanity was its resilience, its capacity to endure, and that endurance was about to be rewarded. His simple, unshakable belief was its own kind of answer, a bulwark against the complex fears of priests and traders. In the depths of the imperial palace, custodian Cassian stood his watch, his own reflection a golden giant in the polished obsidian wall. His contemplation was of legacy and purpose. The soul of humanity to him was its will to achieve greatness. The emperor had been that will incarnate, a living ideal that had been forced into a silent, symbolic existence. The awakening was a return to that ideal, a rebirth of purpose over passive suffering. The cost of their faith had been a drift into superstition, a forgetting of the imperial truth. The potential demise was not of the species, but of its potential for greatness, forever sidelined by a religion of stasis. The single word, remember, was the key. It was a call to shed the comforting shackles of blind faith and reclaim the agency, the reason, the fierce and brilliant destiny that was humanity's true birthright. The soul of man was not defined by whom it worshipped, but by what it dared to build. These solitary reflections, multiplied by billions across the stars, formed a silent chorus of anxiety and hope. The themes of free will and destiny clashed in the quiet of every mind. Was humanity a child, awaiting the command of a waking father? Or was it an adult, being handed back the reins of its own fate after a long, dark childhood? The cost of their 10 millennia faith was now being weighed in the heart of every individual, the cost of comfort, of certainty, of meaning itself. The shared anxiety was a palpable force, the sound of a species holding its breath, waiting to see if the next chapter of its existence would be written by a god, or if, for the first time in 10,000 years, the pen was being passed back into its own trembling hand. The light did not flood the chamber, nor did it blaze. It did not pour forth like a liquid or burn like a star. It simply was, an absolute and undeniable truth made manifest. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's form had been a nexus of incandescent power, a corona of psychic fire so intense it defied mortal sight. But the light that now spilled from him was different. It was the light of a soul, not an engine. It was the light of a consciousness, vast and ancient, turning its gaze outward after an eternity of looking inward. It began with the barest sliver of gold between his eyelids. In the profound, breathless silence of the throne room, that fractional opening was a cataclysm. The custodian on the central dame, Brother Sentinel Cassian, felt his enhanced senses short-circuit, his mind struggling to process an event for which it had no data, no precedent, only a deep genetic memory of awe. The light that escaped was not a beam, but a slow, viscous spill, like molten time itself leaking from a crack in reality. It did not illuminate the chamber so much as redefine it. The shadows cast by this new light were not mere absences of light, but solid, substantive things etched with the ghosts of forgotten promises and ancient wars. The air, already thick with ozone and sanctity, became heavy with the scent of old blood, ozone, and something else, something clean and sharp like the air of Terra before the age of strife. Those standing in the throne room did not see this with their eyes alone. They felt it in their souls. An overwhelming presence descended upon them, a pressure that was both infinitely loving and terrifyingly absolute. It was the feeling of being known, utterly and completely, every secret shame, every hidden virtue, every unspoken hope laid bare before a perception that encompassed galaxies. For Cassian, it was the culmination of his entire existence, the return of the king he was bred to serve. The awe that filled him was a physical force, a golden warmth that threatened to dissolve his auramite armor and leave his soul naked and weeping with joy. He wanted to fall to his knees to prostrate himself, but his training held him rigid, a statue of devotion caught in the first dawn of a new age. But woven through the awe was a thread of pure, undiluted terror. This was not the safe, symbolic god of the ecclesiarchy, a distant martyr to be petitioned with prayer. This was a will, a mind, a being of such immense power that his mere state of wakefulness altered the fabric of the local reality. The tech priests felt their binary can't turn to ash in their minds, their logic circuits overloading with the sheer, impossible data of a living god. The terror was not of harm, but of insignificance. It was the terror of an ant realizing it stands before a mountain that has just decided to think. The presence was so vast it threatened to erase their individual identities, to absorb them back into the singular, colossal consciousness from which all humanity had, in some unknowable way, sprung. The moment unfolded with the slow, inexorable clarity of a dream. The spilled light from the Emperor's barely open eyes began to pool on the polished obsidian floor, not spreading like a liquid, but clinging to the stone, etching it with faint, shimmering patterns that resembled star charts and neural pathways. The low, grinding groan of the golden throne had ceased, replaced by a profound, humming silence that was somehow louder than any noise. It was the sound of a universe holding its breath, the pause between a question asked 10,000 years ago and the answer that was now, finally, beginning to form. The sacred and the frightening were no longer separate concepts. They had fused into a single, overwhelming experience, the first tremor of a divine earthquake that was about to reshape all of creation. The silence shattered, not with a sound, but with motion. As the golden light from the Emperor's eyes continued to bleed into the throne room, the first physical sign of his return manifested. A single skeletal finger, its flesh long since carbonized and fused to the armrest of the golden throne, twitched. It was a minute movement, a tremor so slight it would have been invisible to any but the enhanced vision of the custodians. But in that hallowed space, it was a detonation. The millennia of perfect, agonizing stillness were broken. The unthinkable had become fact. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. As if a single wire had been pulled taut through all of them, the custodian guard sank to one knee in perfect, resonant unison. The crash of their auramite greaves hitting the obsidian floor was a single, thunderous note of fealty, a sound not heard in that chamber since the dawn of the Imperium. They did not bow their heads. Their gaze remained fixed upon the throne, their guardian spears held upright, a forest of gold and steel paying homage to the returning king. For them, this was not an act of worship, but of service reaffirmed. The 10,000-year vigil was over. The watch for their lord's awakening had ended. Around the periphery of the chamber, the tech priests of Mars erupted into a frenzy of silent activity. Their mechanical bodies whirred and clicked, mechadendrites snapping out to interface with every sensor, every console, every arcane instrument pointed at the throne. Glowing data slates filled with streams of information so unprecedented that their machine spirits chirped with alarm. They were not kneeling. They were recording, quantifying, trying to capture the metaphysical event in cold, hard data. Binary Cant, frantic and awestruck, buzzed between them. A litany of impossible energy signatures, psychic resonance levels breaching all known scales, and the simple, staggering confirmation of neuromuscular activity in a body declared biologically static for 10,000 years. They were witnessing the Omnissiah in motion, and their duty was to bear witness, to inscribe the moment in the eternal logs of the Mechanicus. The signal, when it was sent, was not a shout but a whisper, yet it traveled with the speed of thought. A psychic pulse, carrying the raw, undeniable data of the event, shot from the throne room and into the astropathic choir chambers of the imperial palace. The choir, already sensitized to the recent disturbances, received the transmission not as words, but as a wave of pure, overwhelming significance. The message was then relayed, leaping from mind to mind across the void, a psychic telegram of cosmic importance. It reached the secured sanctum of the High Lords of Terra, where their bitter schism was frozen mid-argument by the psychic impact. The Lord Commander's face went pale, his strategic certainties evaporating. The ecclesiarch's eyes widened, his theological gambit suddenly becoming terrifyingly real. The message contained no instructions, no divine pronouncement. It was a single, stark fact: the Emperor has moved. And across the galaxy, the pause was felt. On the bridge of a starship, a navigator guiding his vessel through the warp felt the astronomican's light thrum with a new, vibrant rhythm. In the midst of a desperate firefight, a guardsman felt a surge of inexplicable certainty, his aim steadying as if guided by an unseen hand. A factory worker. On a hive world, a farmer on an agri-world, a rogue trader on the fringes, all, for a single, synchronized heartbeat, felt the universe shift on its axis. It was a sensation deep in the gut, a primal, species-wide intuition that a fundamental threshold had been crossed. The long, suspended animation of the human spirit was over. The galaxy paused, every sentient being from the lowest beast to the highest farseer sensing the irrevocable shift, as the Emperor's first, minute movements hinted at the terrifying, glorious, and utterly unknown new era that was now dawning. Centuries flowed like a slow, deep river, smoothing the jagged edges of history into the soft contours of myth. The Imperium endured as it always had, a great, wounded leviathan that had learned to swim with a different set of scars. On 1,000 worlds, in the dim light of hab units and the echoing halls of Scalams, the story was told. It was never told the same way twice. It was a tale for the dark, a lore too. Sleep too, its truths and fables so intertwined that they had become a single, sacred tapestry. On the agri-world of Veridia Tertius, an old woman, her face a roadmap of sun and soil, would gather her grandchildren close as the planet's twin moons rose. She would tell them of the time of the Golden Dream, when the God Emperor had stretched out his hand across the stars. In her version, he had fully awakened, his voice a gentle thunder that commanded the storms to cease and the blights to wither. He had walked the fields of his people for a single perfect day, his touch causing the gristwheat to grow tall and golden, banishing hunger forever from their world. He had then returned to his throne, his work done, his vigil renewed but his promise lingering in the very soil. The children would listen, their eyes wide, believing every word, the legend as real to them as the dirt under their fingernails. In the scriptorium of a remote abbey on the shrine world of Sanctus Salem, a young novitiate copied a different version onto a fresh sheet of vellum. This text, approved by the Ministorum, spoke of the great trial of faith. It described how the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had allowed a mere phantom of his will to brush against the minds of his subjects, a test to separate the true believers from the faithless. The flicker of the astronomican, the groaning of the throne, the whispers in the warp, all were a divine examination. The schisms, the rebellions, the terror, these were the failures, the chaff burned away. The Imperium that remained, the text declared, was purified, its faith tempered in the fires of doubt and found unbreakable. The novitiate's hand was steady as she wrote, the official truth a comfortable armor against the unsettling ambiguity of the older tales. Aboard a Chartist vessel plying the trade lanes, a grizzled voidsman would share his version over a cup of cheap amasic with the new crew. He'd speak of it not as a miracle, but as a near miss. Collective fever dream born from the stress of a crumbling empire. He'd talk of the chaos, the mutinies, the weeks when the warp was unnavigable and it seemed the entire edifice would come crashing down. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it had stopped. The astronomican steadied, the whispers ceased, the golden throne fell silent once more. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The Imperium had looked into the abyss of its own making, had trembled on the brink of either transcendence or self-annihilation, and had, through sheer, stubborn resilience, simply decided to endure. The event was a ghost, a story to explain the new lines on the faces of their rulers and the subtle shift in the air on every imperial world. The truth of what happened in that throne room became a matter of faith, not fact. Whether the emperor's eyes had truly opened, whether his finger had truly moved, or whether it was all a final, grand psychic spasm of a dying god, was a question for philosophers. And heretics, the custodians who had been there, never spoke of it, their silence itself a form of testament. The Imperium that emerged was different, yet hauntingly familiar. It was an empire that had been forced to remember it could almost break, and in that memory found a deeper, more pragmatic kind of strength. The lore of the awakening, in all its contradictory forms, served a purpose. It was a reflective, sacred story, a reminder of the terrifying fragility of their reality and the immense, silent power that slumbered, or watched, or dreamed, at its heart. It was a tale to be whispered in the dark, a comfort and a warning, the beautiful, ambiguous myth that the great, tired human galaxy had chosen to tell itself in order to sleep.